All indie dyers do is dye and dry. They have no right to charge such extortionate prices. Anyone could do what they do, and I refuse to purchase from them. Hello, everyone. So, once I stopped rolling my eyes, I decided that maybe I should do a pre recorded podcast about everything that you actually do need to know if you're going to be an indie dyer. Um, I've obviously created this using a generator, but it is based off a post that I did see in one of the knitting groups on Facebook a couple of weeks ago. Needless to say, there was a lot going on in the comments there. I will say I didn't actually jump in on that one. I'm sure you're all shocked that I didn't relish the thought at arguing with somebody on the internet. Somebody who's clearly wrong, by the way. Yeah, I just tried to just scroll by, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, I wonder how many people actually think that that's all there is to it, is just flinging some dye onto some yarn and calling it good. You can totally dye yarn as a hobbyist. I encourage people to dye yarn as a hobbyist. It'll give you an idea of the kind of colors that you want to use, and it'll really expand the way that you think about color. Absolutely. Definitely dye yarn as a hobbyist. Great. Awesome. 100%. You should definitely go there and you should do it, and you should take workshops that people offer, and you should have fun with that at home. And yes, absolutely. But to suggest that all indie dyers are doing is dyeing and drying is perhaps a little disingenuous. So I was going to go through the 5 categories of things that indie dyers do need to know. Okay, so the first thing is obvious. The first thing that you need to understand is color theory. I grabbed this image from Canva, which is a website that a lot of people use to put together collages and that kind of thing. I didn't make it, just so you know. We're not quite to that level of we're not quite to that level of professionalism in this podcast as of yet. So many people who have studied art or do graphic design or any of that kind of thing will know the basic tenets of color theory. If you are somebody who is lucky and blessed enough to be quite good at telling colors apart with subtle variations, then color theory probably comes pretty naturally to you. It's probably something that's more of a second nature that you don't have to think too hard about. But there's a lot of people out there, even people who aren't necessarily colorblind, but struggle with color theory and putting together colors for blankets or for projects and that kind of thing. So I kind of just wanted to chat briefly about color theory. It's especially important when dyeing yarn because there's only a very few number of primary pigments when it comes to dyeing yarn. And the rest of the dyes that you buy are basically very cleverly mixed versions of these, and it gets very highly scientific with regards to making sure, obviously the dye manufacturers making sure that every batch will give you a consistent color so that you're not surprised when something that should be viridian turns out more of a weird tealy blue. And ask me how I know that. So when you're dyeing yarn, obviously there's a whole heap of different dyes that you can use. Some people use Kool-Aid, which I used for the first yarn that I ever dyed. I just used some Kool-Aid packets and had a bit of fun. You can use food coloring. You can use there's a brand called Landscape, which basically is everything in there that you need to dye yarn with it. You can use Jacquard, you can use Dharma. There's just huge numbers of different dye manufacturers and suppliers, and all of their mixes are like eensy beensy little difference. So if I order something that looks quite, let's say, let me move my head out of the way and point to the right way. So if I order something from a company that looks very much like a red violet, and I use all of my dye and I go to reorder, but I decide, oh, well, I don't want to order from that company. I'd rather order from this other company. And I order something that looks like it's probably going to be pretty close. The mix could be completely different because each supplier has their own very specific recipes, just like every indie dyer is going to have our own specific recipes on how we dye yarn, and methods as well, which can vary wildly from dyer to dyer. The way that I dye yarn is going to be different from somebody like Dye Candy, different from somebody like Mint Bee, so on and so forth. The other thing with color theory is understanding like a warm versus a cold, so like warmer versus cooler undertones, which makes a big difference when you're mixing colors to exist within the same colorway. So if you're doing kind of, let's say you have a green, so you have yellow green here. Yellow green obviously has a little bit more of a warmer base to it, but then you talk about they don't really have it on this particular color wheel, but a green like Viridian is going to have much more of a blue tone. So when you're mixing that with a purple or a yellow or a violet or this kind of thing, you have to figure out how all those are going to balance each other. And it's probably a little reductive to say that you should only have colors in one colorway that are warm or only that are cool, because you can make some pretty cool you can make some pretty interesting combinations by mixing things and experimenting and really kind of digging into that. But obviously the color theory is something that you obviously have to understand as an indie dyer before you really get into anything else. You have to know what colors you're wanting to use. You have to be willing to experiment with those colors and see kind of your own color profile. That sounds very BuzzFeed, but so your own color profile, what you like, not only what you like to wear, but colors that you like to see mixed together in a way that's unique and interesting and different. Colors that I choose, green, might be different from colors that other indie dyers choose, so on and so forth. So yeah, so that's kind of the first thing that you have to figure out is what colors do you want to be using, what colors do you want to mix together. You have to be willing to experiment, and you have to be able to look at a swatch of a color card, which aren't always accurate, by the way. You have to be able to look at the swatch of a color card and decide what colors you want to try and put together into a colorway, and whether, so yeah, so color theory, that's the number one thing. The number two thing that you're going to want to understand is different yarn bases. So most people know that most indie dyers will be choosing superwash yarns. It's because it's a popular base. Most people like it because it's pretty low maintenance, but also superwash yarns are going to let you get some pretty rad speckles. It is way more difficult to try and get speckles on non-superwash bases, and in some cases you kind of can't get, well, not crisp speckles like here. I wanted to show this image. This is from the upcoming OTP non-repeatable exclusive update, which will be sometime this month. But as you can see, I've used 5 different bases here. These are all superwash bases, just as a disclaimer. But as you can see, we're having some different kind of looking stuff here. So here, this right here is just the standard superhero sock, 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon base. There's some, it's speckly, there's like a lot of pink and some other chunky stuff going on there. And then here we have the sparkle sock. It looks mostly the same. There's not a whole lot of difference in how the colorway has translated. And then here, let me move my head out of the way. Here we have DK sock. So as you can see, it's starting to look a little bit different, and that's because obviously the weight of the yarn is different, and those speckles are going to look different on a 4-ply yarn, where the speckle is going to be maybe over 2 or 3 strands, versus the DK, and even more so for the chunky weight, that speckle is only going to be on 1 strand of yarn instead of 4, so it's going to knit up different. It's going to look a bit different in the skein, even though these were all dyed at the same time in the same pan for purposes of this demonstration, so you're welcome. And then over here we have this outlier. I feel a bit like a meteorologist here. Then we have this outlier here. This is the yak sock, so you'll notice that looks wildly different than the other yarns. Wildly different. In fact, you would say it doesn't even necessarily look like the same colorway. So that's because yak sock, well, specifically this yak sock, I can't speak for everybody's different yarn bases, but this yak sock, the natural color of it is quite a grayish sort of natural looking shade, and it works really well with deeper shades with like reds and purples. It really just makes those colors super rich and really pop. But for this, obviously it looks different. I'm not going to say that it looks bad because I still quite like it. It's just very different from the other yarns because that really light pink that was used initially on the other shades doesn't really show up on the gray base. Again, even though it was dyed at the same time, that pink doesn't really show up. And those other speckles, while they do show up on the gray base, it does look quite different. So that's the other thing, is kind of knowing your bases and knowing how things are going to interact differently. So to show you kind of an extreme case, I have an image here. Let me get my head out of the way. Okay, so this is kind of an extreme case of how different bases can look wildly different. So these are both Spyro. They were dyed using the exact same formula, and I measure out all of my dyes with scientific science with grams and things. It's not just averages. I make sure that everything's quite precise. It's the only way that I can manage to make things look the same for repeatable shades. But anyway, so Spyro was initially just on this chunky alpaca base here, and then I decided, oh, it might be quite fun to have it. It might be quite fun to do it on a sock yarn. And also I wanted to show you, for purposes of this podcast, to show you how wildly different they are. Wildly different. So the thing is with this chunky alpaca, it's not superwash. And with alpaca, it tends to drag color up the fiber a lot faster and more aggressively than it's going to be with a superwash. Or even just merino wool in general. It kind of just, it'll stay kind of where you put it. But yeah, with this chunky alpaca, it just drags everything up. You end up with a much more subtle, sort of multi-tonal, like you can't even really tell in the picture, but there's, there's gold in there. But those gold pops and the darker pops of purple are obviously way more aggressive on the superwash sock base. So that's the other thing, is understanding how the different bases work. And this isn't even going into other bases that I don't necessarily have on hand, like Blueface Leicester, like using like an ecological wool, something that's not merino. And those things are all going to behave differently as well. Silk, which I don't personally dye, silk behaves differently. And also, that's not even getting into into plant-based dyeing, because the dye process is so wildly different that it's gonna be, well, I'm not gonna say not, because again, there might be a dyer out there with these particular skill set that I don't have, but it is quite difficult to have a color that would translate perfectly from like an animal fiber base, like a wool or an alpaca, to a plant-based like bamboo or cotton or linen. So there's a lot of things to consider with bases, and how it's going to happen or how it's going to take up the dye, how that's going to work, and being able to kind of sort of predict what's going to happen before you fling dye in the pan. That's the other thing, is you kind of have to be willing to make maybe sort of expensive mistakes where you dye something thinking this is going to look amazing, and then maybe you miscalculated the dye, maybe you miscalculated what was going to happen with the bases, maybe it was a bit like of a thirstier base than you thought, and then you end up with something that looks, more muted than you want, or what have you. And it happens even to experienced dyers. I mean, there's people way more experienced than me. I'm still kind of a baby when you compare me to people who've been around for 10 years and stuff. For example, yesterday I was dyeing up what was meant to be the prototype for the Gem Fusion Club. I was like, this is gonna look great. And then I added a couple of colors, and I was like, yeah, this is looking good. And then I added a couple more colors, and I was like, no, wait, this isn't what I wanted. And then the more I tried to fix it, the worse it got, until I ended up with just kind of, it's not bad, because that's very subjective, but it's not what I had envisioned. And it's because I wasn't really paying attention to a few different variables. So those are things that you have to know and understand and be able to consider and experiment with, again, because I mean, even over and above these dyes, you end up with stuff that's maybe a bit more difficult to dye, stuff that doesn't take up the dye as readily and easily and needs a lot more encouragement, let's say. So I will move on to the next thing. So the next thing that you're gonna have to know how to do if you're an indie dyer, especially if you're an indie dyer who wants to make enough money to keep doing it, is that you're gonna have to understand marketing. You're gonna have to do a whole bunch of boring research about Facebook algorithms and Instagram algorithms and best practices and how to build an email list. And, you know, some people really enjoy it. I don't mind it too much, but there's some people who really hate it. They hate marketing. They can't stand it. They don't want to have to keep on track, keep on top of changing things. These things are always changing. Algorithms always changing. The stuff always changing. It can be quite a time suck to stay on top of it, for sure. So there's some people that hate it. They'd rather just stick with the creative process. But then if nobody knows where you are, they can't buy yarn from you. So then it becomes, you know, how are you going to sustain that as even if it's not your main business, even if it's just a side hustle, as they say? How are you going to get and maintain, you know, customers in order to pay for the yarn that's coming in? And the dye and the extra water and the extra electricity and so on and so forth. So marketing is definitely something that you're going to have to learn. And the poster of that original comment, I feel, probably didn't take that into consideration either. I mean, I would love it if yarn sold itself and packed itself up and went off to its new adoptive homes with me having to do anything, and I was just able to just focus on prettiness, but unfortunately that's not really how it works. And there is, like I said a minute ago, there is quite a lot of time involved in keeping on top of these things and building these things and making it more streamlined and more sustainable for yourself to keep up with. Like, these things, they all take time. Building a website last summer took ages. It took forever. It took 5 ever, in fact. Not just getting all the listings up, but all of the things on the back end and making sure that stuff wasn't broken, which it usually was because it's me, and having to enlist someone to help me figure out sort of the quirks. So, I mean, learning how to put up your own website, that's a whole nother kettle of fish. It's a whole nother stash of yarn to use a very relevant term there. But, you know, it's these things, they take time, and I don't know, I feel like if you take time to learn something and then somebody wants to buy something from you, whether it's yarn or cross stitch or a website package, you know, I mean, people have to realize that they're not just paying you for the finished object, they're paying you for all the other time that you spend sitting at your desk at 3 a.m. trying to finish something or figure something out or what have you, or reading articles about what's changed with the Instagram algorithm and trying to figure it out and then realizing that it's futile. I always pronounce that wrong. Anyway, the point is, algorithms are mysterious and evil beasts, and all we can do is try to do our very best and hope that that's enough. But there is quite a lot to keep track of. And okay, so I'm going to talk about the next thing. So the other thing that you have to understand, or have to learn, rather, not everybody just comes out of a box knowing these things, is the chemistry of dyeing. I can't tell you how many times I've seen in a Facebook group that somebody says, oh, you know, my yarn is, maybe it's bleeding a little bit of color. I don't know, you know, whether it's indie dyed or whether it's not. And I always see somebody say, oh, just soak it in vinegar. But that's not going to do anything. It has to, because in order to actually dye yarn, you don't just need the acid, which is either acetic acid, i.e. vinegar, or citric acid, which obviously that is naturally present in things like orange juice and grapefruits, but you can get it in a crystallized powdered form. You don't just need the acid and the dye, you need heat in order to make that chemical reaction happen so that the molecules are actually binding themselves together. rather than just kind of vaguely staining, and then it's not going to be set. It's not going to remain that color. It's going to fade. It's going to run color. So if you do have yarn that's maybe bleeding a little bit, if you did get it from an indie dyer, I would say contact them. They want to know for sure, because that's it's probably, well, depending on how much, it's probably not super normal if you have like masses of dye. A tiny bit is pretty normal, and that can also be affected by my next point, which is the pH of your water can wildly change how things dye. I can't tell you how many indie dyers I've seen posting being like, oh my god, I've moved and now we have a different water supply and my dye recipes, like, none of them are working correctly. It's frustrating, and they have to basically relearn everything because the water quality is what's making it different. So I had mentioned, obviously, with regards to acid. So, I mean, most city water supplies are going to be a pretty pH neutral of 7. But then you have the hard and soft water components, which refers to kind of the minerals and stuff in your tap water, which can wildly change what happens when you throw it in a pan with some heat and some dye. Those maybe trace amounts of minerals can interact with your dyes and then do weird, unexpected things. So if your water quality is wildly different from the dyers, it can result in a little bit of dye bleed, but it's not necessarily a crisis. Like I said, if it's an indie dyer, do contact them before you start posting in Facebook groups. That's like our number one fear, I think, for most of us. Like, straight up nightmares about people being like, it's terrible and it's ruined my project. Like, you wake up in a cold sweat. If it's a mass-produced yarn, it depends on what it is. If it's acrylic, I can't help you because those require largely industrial dye processes. Most of us don't have those in our homes because it could be potentially dangerous. Again, I'm not saying nobody does it. There could be people who have the setup for that, and cool. I don't. Most indie dyers, I think, don't have a setup to dye acrylic. Acrylic shouldn't really be bleeding color, so maybe talk to the manufacturer then. The other thing is that so I mentioned acetic, citric acid. Those are the most common for acid dyes. Now, if you're dyeing plant fibers, then you're probably going to be using soda ash, which is it's a variant of a kind of salt, kind of. But soda ash it's what you use in tie-dye kits, basically. It's what. Well, I guess most tie-dye kits come pre-mixed, but anyway, just trust me, it's in there. That's the most common thing for plant-based dyeing. There are, however, other things that you can use. And even more so if you're talking about natural dyeing. So if you're doing natural dyeing, you need what's called as a mordant, which kind of creates the extra kind of electron things to actually chemically bond with the yarn. I personally don't like using mordants because I don't have a studio set up in order to filter those mordants back out of the water before I dump it down the drain or outside into the flower pot. So I personally don't use mordants because many of them are metal based. So, and I saw once upon a time in a Facebook group long ago, there was somebody who said that she was using a non-standard acid or mordant. And the thing is, so she was using this non-standard thing, and then very just kind of absent-mindedly was using bleach to clean her dye pans out at the end of the day. And like, I don't know, bleach is like, you know, on the back of your bleach containers, it's always going to say don't mix it with other things because you have the risk of creating chloramine gas, which is super mega ultra toxic. Like, you don't want to be breathing that stuff because it will burn your lungs and potentially kill you. So she was using this non-standard thing and then was using bleach and then realized, you know, as she was starting to feel really choked up and starting to feel a bit sick, that she's realizing that she had mixed two things that had basically created chloramine gas in her garage. And so she had to, you know, kind of fumigate the house and everything. So obviously it was just a one-off accident, but in that case, but that's something that you have to be aware of. You have to understand how these things interact and what potentially it could end up with if you're not just using this sort of very food safe acetic i.e. vinegar, or citric acid, which is, you can get food grade stuff. So it's, people get it to put in their protein shakes. I don't know why, but I'm not really a protein shake kind of person. I'm sure you're all shocked to hear that. So that's another thing that you have to be aware of. So, you have to be aware of your acid. You have to be aware of not heating your yarn too much, obviously, because that could felt. I guess that can kind of go back into the bases category. And, well, I'll add an addendum to that I once accidentally felted an entire batch of that chunky alpaca because I wasn't paying attention and the pot got too hot. And that heat is usually, like, that level of heat, it's usually pretty fine for superwash stuff. Like, it's pretty hardy, it'll be alright, but not that alpaca. I pulled it out and it was just one big, like, huge clumped yarn monster. So that's another thing you have to kind of be aware of with your with your bases, which I realized should have gone in the previous point, but so yeah, so you have to be aware of, like, the level of heat that you're using to make sure that it's hot enough to actually make those chemical reactions, that bonding, happen. You have to understand what acid you're using. You have to understand, like, the different kinds of pigments and the dye styles, because with plant-based dyeing, you're not using heat in 99% of cases. There are a couple of dyes that do require you to use heat, but most of the time you are not using heat. And you have to understand that, how what you're using could potentially interact with your cleaning agents. So, okay, I will move into the next point. Now, which is having to know everything else. I realize that sounds quite broad, but just hear me out. Hear me out. So these are things like knowing how to dress the burns that you're inevitably going to get. I get like 47 burns a day on average. It's being able to look at sort of the yarn industry and kind of see, well, what's trendy? What are people wanting? Are people wanting, this kind of yarn? Are people looking for superwash, for non-superwash? Are they looking for specialized bases? And kind of keep on track of that. And on top of that, to kind of stay a bit current. It's keeping on track of new laws and legislation, which is something that is not fun, and I don't know anyone who actually enjoys that. So those are things like, there was a new sort of process implemented for international post, and this was worldwide. And this means that most countries are wanting to be able to deal with customs electronically, so you're having to submit that information electronically. And if you weren't already using a system that allowed for that, there was kind of a lot of question marks, and nobody really knew what was going on. Even a lot of local postmasters didn't know what was going on, so it was a lot of research and digging into these complex documents about postal systems. Come on, that's not fun. Well, I don't know. Somebody probably thinks it's fun. I don't. It's keeping on track of that stuff. It's keeping on track of countries that implement tariffs on specific kinds of wool or animal fibers or whatever. It's keeping on track of how trade wars affect the cost of things like silk and certain kinds of dyes, because they come from countries that the importing country has a trade war going on with. It's keeping on track of accounting, which even if you have an accountant, you still kind of have to do some of it yourself. I don't personally have an accountant because they cost money. Maybe someday I will be able to afford somebody to do it for me, and that would be great. But until then, it's having to do accounting and know the tax laws and what's allowed as an expense and what isn't allowed as an expense. And it's learning how to get the dye out of your countertops for those of us who don't have a studio, which is which is fun, especially if you're a bit accident prone and messy like me. And yeah, it's a never ending list. It's keeping it, like when everything happened with GDPR, I don't know, 6 months ago or whatever it was, when that came into force, you had to make your websites compliant. You had to make your email newsletters compliant. You had to figure out what the hell you were supposed to do to end up being, to to be compliant and not get in trouble later on, to keep your to make sure that your data was all safe. I mean, that's not something that most small businesses and indie dyers are going to have an immediate innate knowledge of. You're going to have to go and read a whole bunch of boring articles. It's stuff like that, like local legislation, international legislation, trade wars. Yeah, and then just the mundane stuff like getting the dye out of your countertops and figuring out how to not burn your arm for the 57th time this week. And of course, there's a whole bunch of stuff in with the everything else label that I probably have forgotten to write down here. So apologies for that. So those are just a few of the things that you need to know if you're going to be an indie dyer. Color theory, how your bases are interacting with each other, the marketing aspect, which again, some people don't enjoy. I don't mind it that much. Chemistry and water quality and and acid levels and pH levels and potential chemical interactions, and then everything else under the big tent of everything else. So there is quite a lot that you're doing other than just dyeing and drying. Even if all you were doing was dyeing and drying, that's still a fair bit of work, even if you're doing it, as a hobbyist. There's choosing the colors, there's getting the dyes, there's actually doing the dyeing. Some people do really elaborate hand painting. Some of my shades are almost annoyingly hand painted, i.e. there's no real shortcuts. You just have to hand paint every shade, which takes time, of course, and then it's rinsing to make sure that all of your dye has taken up and there's going to be no dye bleed, and heating and then rinsing. Don't rinse and then heat. That won't do what you want it to do. There's heating, then there's rinsing, and then there's, you've got to wait till it dries, and then you've got to, some people reskein, or even if not, then you're twisting up the skein, you're labeling it. There's still a lot of work there, even if you're completely discounting everything else that you need to know and research and keep on top of it if you're wanting to actually be an indie dyer. So, Jane Doe from the Facebook group, whose name has been changed to protect her identity, I respectfully disagree. And that's all I have to say about that. So I realize that this is kind of a short podcast. I wanted to keep it quite focused just on that in case people wanted to watch just this one to see what does an indie dyer really know. So if you did like that, I urge you, beg you, plead to like this video and please subscribe, leave a comment about whether you've ever dyed yarn or what you think, or if you have any questions about dyeing yarn. I'm quite happy to help out with almost anything. So like I said, do please like and subscribe. That's the law. You have to say it on you have to say that on YouTube. We do live streams every Saturday night with games, and then I try to have a pre-recorded podcast up every Tuesday. So next Tuesday, we'll resume with regular service of showing you what I haven't completed yet, and some stuff that will be coming up quite soon. So thanks everyone. Now you know what an indie dyer has to know.